Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People with Ben Burgess and Stefan Bertram. And today we are talking intelligent design and whether, if there's any numerical number greater than zero of cheers, we should give it.
Uh, yeah. So there was a case by David Moulton, published in Compact Magazine a couple weeks ago, for 2 cheers. I'm not sure how he arrived at that number. The
Have you
article
seen
doesn't
those things
exact.
before of like other two cheer things, like two cheers for anarchism?
I certainly haven't seen 2 cheers for anarchism. No.
It's a bit of a funny thing. I mean, I don't know when three cheers became like the thing. But yeah, two
Yeah, I mean,
cheers. It's a lot, even for the case he kind of puts in the article. Even if we kind of take the article very seriously, I think it's the best one cheer.
yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, the only thing besides this essay I've ever written that had a number of cheers was 2 years ago. I guess about a year and a half ago, I wrote an article for The Nation about Josh Hawley, who was, basically criticizing the Democrats for stopping the rail strike. And the point of the article was sort of like, yeah, he's right, but a little strange that the rest of his views don't reflect this. And
Yeah, it's like why didn't we get to stop the rail strike?
the editor, so I was going back and forth with the editor about what to call it, and Don Gudenplan, and he was like, okay, about 2 cheers for Josh Hawley. I was like, no way, man, I'm not doing more than 1.5 cheers for Josh Hawley. That's my maximum number of cheers offer.
Okay, so I'm glad that we have a full schematic of cheer numbering between 0 and 3.
Yeah. It's a little funny that 3 is somehow just the number that we as a society have landed on for maximum cheers. That it would be unthinkable to say, I don't know, hip 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 hooray. But yeah, in any case, so David Moulton, writing in Compact, is revisiting the intelligent design wars of the mid 2000s. And I think the kind of immediate news hook for him doing so is that, 3 cheers in this economy, is that Tucker Carlson was recently on the Joe Rogan show, and in that appearance, Tucker Tucker kind of casually said that he didn't believe in evolution, which got a little bit of surprise pushback from Joe. And Moulton said, "Oh, this feels like a throwback, right? People used to argue about this all the time." And he talks a bit about, about that version of the culture war, and how specifically it ended up getting fought over Darwinism and intelligent design. And he kind of rehearses some of the classic intelligent design arguments. He interviewed one of the intelligent design advocates at the time for his article, and he basically says, it's a little bit confusing actually. If I do end up having some kind of conversation with Moulton about this, maybe we can clarify this, but it's a little bit confusing what he's actually saying in the article, because he never quite says this is correct, right? The intelligent design is right. He doesn't quite say
they're wrong. He's doing PU 555Y shit.
I have no idea what you just said. Oh, sorry, I got it.
Pussy
shit.
Yeah, I didn't want to say it, but then I said it. But then you got it anyway, so I could have not said it. But then But yeah, I mean that's it, right? This is the thing that conservatives will do, or right wing people will do. I guess leftists do it too. where you're not quite willing to come out with your completely ridiculous views. So you just do this kind of thing where you like throw a load of dirt in the air and then complain that people sneer at your dirt.
Yeah. Hold on just a second. I'm going to switch wireless networks, so I might be gone for a moment.
Wow, you did in fact go. I'm
Oh, no.
nice.
Well, I'm back.
Yeah.
Say some stuff.
Hi. Hello. Yo.
All right. That was all fine. So I'm cautiously optimistic that switching the network did it. Uh, okay. Yeah, because you were roboting out a little bit for me, but I'm like 100% sure it was my connection, not yours.
Okay.
But yes, yes. If our connection was better, I probably could have communicated more quickly that I got what you were trying to say. But in any case, I I mean, I think that he's doing a thing that a certain kind of article, I don't know, like a think piece, if that's exactly how you say it, does a lot that I find a little frustrating, which is, given my particular, background and biases, I kind of think that the way that you should write stuff is you should say, here's my position. Now here's an argument for it.
That's fucking academic bullshit. Then a clear thesis, clear arguments.
Whereas there is a certain kind of style that, yeah, some compact stuff has it. Yeah, some New Yorker stuff has it, right? Where you kind of, nibble around an issue, and and you definitely suggest some views on it, but you don't quite like come out with them. And so, yeah, I don't know if Moulton, like, neither the article nor our subsequent Twitter interactions totally made it clear to me.
No, I
Like,
didn't know. I didn't know you got into it.
yeah, a little bit. Totally made it clear to me whether he actually like accepts the conclusion. Like, he certainly seems to be at least somewhat sympathetic to it, but it's not, he never quite comes out and says it, right? Like, there's I always think of this talk at the University of Miami many years ago where somebody from like a visiting speaker was, I don't know, giving some weird talk about like anthropology and philosophy, where they were saying some sort of strange relativist things about like shamanism and like that. Um, and
Indigenous
my
practices.
and my and my friend Mark, in his inimitable style, said, "Okay, but like, do you think magic is real or not?" Right?
Are there wizards, and can we get them in here and make them do shit?
Yeah, and it's it's a little bit. I did have a little bit of that same feeling here. It's like, yeah, come on, do you actually think that this is correct or not? Because he never quite says. He also never quite says whether it should have been taught in public schools, which is of course what quite a bit of the culture war at the time was about. But all he sort of clearly says is that he thinks that there's like, an interesting argument there, and people were like unfairly canceled a bit too much at the time for saying these things, right? I mean, like that's about the gist of it. And my own view is simpler, right? I mean, the title of the compact article is 2 cheers for intelligent design. Mine is 0 cheers for intelligent design creationism, which is to say, like, I just think that it's bullshit. That My view on this is that, to put this in Quinian terms, right? Our best overall theory of the world includes unguided evolution by natural selection, and that if you say, oh no, actually, because there are allegedly these problems for it, and we'll get into it, but there are allegedly these problems, and because of that, you should actually see these problems as evidence for the some sort of divine intervention at some point in the process. And by the way, very tellingly, the intelligent design crowd, at least from everything I ever saw at the time, were extremely vague about how much divine intervention we were talking about, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to do my classic thing of kind of pointing out that, like, theologically, why would you try and fight for this? Like, why would God need to do intelligent design if God can exactly foresee every single event and has the power
yeah,
to make the world however he wants to be? Unless you
yeah,
think
what?
it's physically impossible by random chance, well, not random chance, by
Uh,
physical mechanism for these things to evolve, then why would
yeah,
God need to
partially.
intervene?
Yeah, partially by random chance, partially by selective pressure. Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, this is not an original analogy to me, but it's one I've always found very helpful. Um, and in fact, I think the person I'm stealing this from was a nun. But it's like, look, think about it like playing pool. Surely an all-powerful God should be able to sink all the balls in, the initial strike, right? Like, that you shouldn't need to like keep coming back to do divine intervention to get those last couple of balls, recalcitrant balls sunk. um and yeah, I think as like a theological objection that seems kind of devastating, but of course, I also just think that this is not a good way of doing scientific inquiry if we're going to take it seriously on those terms. Um, and it, I don't know. I understand that depending on, who your assumed crowd is, this maybe seems like so obvious it's totally uninteresting. It's like, you know, if we're going to come on and do one of these things and be like, I'm pretty sure the Egyptians built those pyramids. I don't think it was UFOs. Uh,
Did
but
you say Joe Rogan did have a like ancient pre-Bronze Age civilization pseudo-archaeological guy debate an actual archaeology guy on his pod?
uh, I did see that. Yeah, I have not watched most of it, but I saw some clips of it. Um, that's yeah. I mean, look, for better or worse, right? I mean, that's surely what you're tuning in for.
Yeah, yeah,
But
no, and I watched another video about that guy, and he seemed like a lot of fun.
yeah, um, yeah. So but I think this is interesting for a couple reasons. Um, one of which, well, I guess the most important of which is just that I actually think that most people who sort of say, yeah, obviously creationism is nonsense, don't actually know how to make that case. Um, that
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before, right? That the vast majority of people don't understand evolution. And if you ask people to explain it, like 20% will give you like some kind of Lamarckism.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, because I think that to understand exactly what's wrong with this, it helps to understand what the biological orthodoxy is. And since that's what people are trying to defend, and I think probably most people like legitimately just just don't do that, right? I mean, so I mentioned at the beginning of the essay, I can vividly remember in like, I don't know, like 2003 maybe, um, you know, sitting, I was like home from college and I was sitting in my old bedroom watching TV, and there was some kind of bill in the state legislature at the time in Michigan to do equal time for, I don't even remember if at that point they used the phrase intelligent design or not, right? But
Right, because
to
this was like early 2000s rebranding.
yeah, exactly, yeah. Um, and so they had like a conservative Christian Republican who was in favor of it, debating on the local TV news this like Democratic legislator who was against it. And I remember just being really struck that the Democrat like so manifestly didn't know what Darwinism was really, right? Like that he kind of knew that, it's what like the smart scientists thought, and that it had something or other to do with things coming about with, in a godless way by some sort of process of gradual change. But I'm like 90% sure that that was like the limit of what he understood about it. Right. So, you mentioned like Lamarckianism, which, which says that, you have like inheritance of acquired traits, between generations. And yeah, I think like the difference, actually, that was an old joke in The Simpsons, that some irate, I don't know, Ned Flanders probably, leads a group of parents into the school to demand that they teach alternatives to Darwinian evolution. And Principal Skinner says, "Oh, you mean like Lamarckian evolution?" Uh, but yeah, I think like probably most people who sort of vaguely accept Darwinism in the same way that like they vaguely accept the special theory of relativity or whatever, right? That they kind of know that that's that's like the scientific consensus, couldn't really explain it to save their lives. Which is a shame because it's interesting, and I actually think this is all stuff that, like, there are details that that where biological expertise is obviously going to be relevant, and all I can really do is say it's like, well, I don't know, people who seem to know what they're talking about, seem to think that, but like, but
I mean, it does definitely show that how few people can understand evolution. That regardless of where intelligent design is taught in school, it doesn't really seem like evolution is.
yeah, not in any particularly meaningful way. Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. That I I think that yeah, like this is stuff that there's absolutely no reason that everybody shouldn't come out of like a well-taught 8th grade biology class basically getting. Um, and like the sort of basic mechanics of Darwinian evolution are something that like any layman should be able to get no problem, even if there are details, of course, that involve more expertise. And I think that the sort of basic outline of why the intelligent design argument is silly should also, again, I think be kind of accessible to any layman, right? So, like on the most basic ground level, right? So, um, you know, contemporary evolutionary biology says that the uh, Darwin, Einstein, all I know is my cell phone works and this beer is cold. My uncle, who was not well taught in biology class. Yeah, fair enough. Um, yeah, like so the basic mechanism does indeed involve an element of randomness. But it also involves significant non-random element. So I used to do this thing like when, I don't know, late 2000s, I would teach intro to philosophy classes at Miami-Dade College, and we're going over the arguments for the existence of God, and I would talk about William Paley, who famously, his book Natural Theology at the beginning of the 19th century has this example about finding a watch at the beach. And you could conclude that over the course of the millennia, the random movements of the water and the sand, wearing away at some rock, miraculously formed it into the exact shape of a working pocket watch that actually tells time. Or you could say that a watchmaker made it. And of those two, the second one is far and away a better explanation. And so by analogy,
In the absence of a great deal of evidence for the strange, but in the end true form of proposition.
yeah, I mean, look, in the literally in the watch example, it's a better explanation that was made by a watchmaker. And Paley's, and Paley's analogy is like, look around at nature, that you have this self-contained system that's far more intricate and elaborate than the gears that you'll find if you open up the watch. That you have animals that have oxygen around them that they can breathe and doesn't poison them, and they have other plants and animals that they can eat, and the animals they eat have other plants and animals they can eat, and the eyes work, right? The eye is
Have you
is like,
seen those gifs of like crazy intricate stuff that goes on like millions of times a day in your body? Like there's this one of like this little thing in your body crawling along some kind of line to deliver like power or whatever energy to some other cell, and it's like it's crazy that that just keeps happening and I don't just die.
totally right. So it's like, yeah, this is incredibly complicated, incredibly intricate, and and harmonious, right? Like, and if the two explanations that you can think of is that this all just happened to randomly come together this way, right? Like then, or like a sort of popular intelligent design wars era update on Paley, or maybe a little bit earlier than that, but late 20th century kind of creationist analogy was, imagine a tornado blowing through a junkyard, and it resulting in a working Boeing 747. That just that's would not happen, right? So yeah, it's, if the two explanations you can think of are either the equivalent of the erosion created the watch, or the tornado blowing through the junkyard created the Boeing 747, or that there is a supernatural designer, you can definitely see the appeal of option number two. But then I would say, trying to gently guide people, of course, since the mid 19th century, we have had an option number three to explain the way the natural world is. What would that be? And it used to depress the shit out of me that like there'd be like 5 seconds of silence, and somebody would be like, evolution. I'm like, yeah, very good, right? Evolution. Well, fill out this phrase for me. Evolution by, what's the rest of that? And then people would struggle with it. They'd be like, come on, guys, right? You like, this is your biology teachers in high school did you a horrible disservice. But yeah, it's that natural selection. In other words, mutation creates genetic variation, and then selective pressure, i.e., what the condition, what kinds of traits, and there's like a little bit of a complicated discussion to be had in terms of biology and philosophy of biology about what the unit of selection is, right? Or
Right.
you know, but like so like that and a lot of people now would say it's really the thing being selected for the actual genes, right? But the sort of classic thing to say is that it's sort of general traits are being selected for, but
On the Short Paper Survey, it's 43.55% for genes and to 43.11 for organisms.
okay,
So
yeah.
a perfect unconsensus among philosophers, at least.
Yeah. Like, but however you think of it, right? You have variation, and because of random mutation and variation, like, but then the significant non-random element is that you are more likely, like the variants that are more likely to survive are the ones with traits that are helpful to surviving in whatever environments they find themselves in, which is also, I think, one of the crucial things when you're trying to wrap your head around this, that it's not, people think of this as linear. So they have there are these, like, I don't know, classic old timey illustrations of evolution where there's like I don't know, something that's like sort of a fish climbing out of the water, and then there's something else, and then there's like, this like ape-like creature, and then there's us, and that like sort of helps, like that inculcates a way of thinking about this where you tend to think of it as being teleological, right? As having
Yeah,
like
like
a
Whiggish
yeah,
evolution.
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, you tend to think of it as if there's like a predefined endpoint that it goes towards, or a sort of predefined direction. Whereas the more accurate thing to say is, well, you certainly have greater complexity over time, but like is that it's like, no, it's the arrows should be pointing off in all kinds of different directions, because whatever the selective pressures are in a given environment um, are going to depend on the specific features of that environment, right? The features that help you survive in one environment aren't going to be helpful in another. Like so a sort of like classic biology textbook sort of illustration is about the pepper moths, right? That you have um, that with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the darker colored pepper moths are more likely to survive because they blend into a soot covered environment. And but then once the beginning of like modern environmental regulation comes about, the selective pressures change. Um, and that's a small that's a small scale example. And the and so once you've got this in place, right? So then you have various forms of creationism, and creationism classic is 6-day creationism, right? If you that's like what the Scopes monkey trial is about, right? If you Oh god, I'm blanking on the name of the movie about it.
Oh, right. Yeah, I can't remember it either.
Inherit the Wind, is that it?
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
1960.
Yep. Inherit the Wind. Right. So if you watch that, right, like that's a like that's what they're fighting about there, right? So that you have like cross examination questions about you know where Cain's wife came from, if everybody's descended from Adam, and stuff like that. Uh,
And why aren't we allowed to marry our relatives?
yeah. uh, and then but then like after the courts over time impose some basic church state separation on that. It's like, no, you can't just blatantly teach what's supposed to be the product of special revelation in biology class. The and of course at the the scopes time, um, the issue is whether it's okay to teach evolution at all. And then of course as the war of position continues, creationists end up retreating to, okay, we've sort of accepted that we're going to people are going to teach evolution, but can we at least also teach our stuff? And
In
then
science class.
in science class, yeah. Which of course it's never been a problem to say yeah, sure, like it's never been an issue to say yeah, you can teach, you can have the Bible be a textbook in a comparative religions class, or a literature class maybe, right? All totally fine, right? But yeah, in science class. And then of course is there church state problems with even get equal time there. There's a point where people start using phrases like scientific creationism to sort of say, no, creationism is actually its own, scientific theory. And in some cases, there's also another relevant distinction going on in the background here, which is between six-day biblical literalist creationism and old earth creationism. So I once had old earth creationism, so 6-day creationism, you have to bite a lot of weird bullets. I once had a Orthodox rabbi tell me that it's like, look, God could have just created an old earth. If Adam chopped down a tree on the first day in the Garden of Eden, it would have had rings in it, which is,
Yeah, I mean, you have to, when you're doing 6-day creation, you have to be like, you have to have think something really weird about dinosaurs. There's a few options, but there's definitely something weird going on.
Yeah. Cause yeah, you could the classic thing is that God put the dinosaur bones there to test our faith. You could also do more fun and exotic options about how there are various monsters that might be referred to at different points in the book of Genesis. Oh my God, I did not know Answers in Genesis' thing on the website about how incest was okay right up until the flood. That's fun.
I guess it's a thing of like, well, what else are we going to do?
Yeah. I mean, it also must have been okay for a while after the flood, though, right? Because you're still
Right,
starting.
you're down to a one family again.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you picked up some drifters clinging to rocks and fucked them.
Sure. So, yeah. Sorry, I just want to link. Okay, very good. But anyway, yeah. So yes, very, very good question. In fact, from what I can recall from the book of Genesis, apart from the unmentioned drifters, rescued for breeding purposes from the rocks they were clinging to, it does seem to be heavily implied that that we're all descended from some father-daughter procreation. But in any case, and more than implied, right? Because you have begat lists, right? Anyway, but yeah, so incest must have started to be bad, both morally and also just in terms of biological consequences at some point considerably after that. So yeah, you could say the dinosaur bones had something to do with various monsters mentioned at different points in the book of Genesis. Although you pretty much have to reject carbon dating to make that work. Yes, God intervened to prevent the recessive genes from producing birth defects. Confusing. Yeah. So, but then you have old Earth creationism, where you say, well, maybe when Genesis says day, that doesn't mean what we mean by days, right? Maybe you can have billion-year days or something. So maybe God does these things in stages. and you still, and so you can, like, you don't have to be a carbon dating denier. You maybe don't even have to be a dinosaur denier. I think this is the kind of creationism that leads to people saying a lot of things like, well, microevolution is okay, right? Like the pepper moths, or, again, you can actually pretty easy to, like, to simulate like small scale evolution going on in a laboratory setting.
Right, because you obviously have the problem of like, why does selective breeding work? Why do those conditions reappear in a less kind of direct form in the natural environment?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So you have people be like, okay, microevolution is fine, but I don't believe in macro evolution. Right. So yeah, sure, you can have little biological changes that are explained by mutation and selection, but the big ones you couldn't have gotten, human beings that way. And then, there's also a third option here, which is like guided evolution, where you sort of say, you say, okay, well, maybe the evolutionary story is pretty much right, but at crucial moments, you have divine intervention to make it all work. And the intelligent design crowd, at least as far as I could ever tell at the time, mostly sounded like they were saying the third thing. Although I also think that as a branding exercise, it was meant to be pretty ecumenical, right? Like that, like, it's like, oh, our theory is that something or other involving an intelligent designer happened, right? So,
yeah. The theory of the gaps.
Yeah, exactly, right? So it's like, this is, so in Moulton's article in Compact, he quotes various derisive things that people said at the time, where they suggested that, as a, intelligent design is a Trojan horse for evangelical Christianity, which is very much the impression that Moulton's trying to push back by being like, oh, look how smart and interesting these guys and their arguments are. And they're actually like these very thoughtful intellectuals and everything. But also, like, look, there is definitely more than nothing to the Trojan horse for like evangelical Christian culture war view. There's something called the Wedge document from 1998 that was leaked later, where they they say that so the Discovery, this is from the Discovery Institute, which was the big think tank pushing intelligent design, that they say the proposition that human beings are created in the image of God is one of the bedrock principles on which Western civilization was built. Its influence can be detected in most, if not all, of the West's greatest achievements, including representative democracy, human rights, free enterprise, and progress in the arts and sciences. Yet a little over a century ago, this cardinal idea came under wholesale attack by intellectuals drawing on the discoveries of modern science, blah, blah, blah. The cultural consequences of this triumph of materialism were devastating. The discovery, blah, blah, blah. The Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture seeks nothing less than the overthrow of materialism and its cultural legacies. And they explain how intelligent design can be helpful for that. This is not a document originally meant for public consumption.
I mean, that's a really funny line, because that's now what the right says about the left, right? They want to overthrow materialism.
Yeah. If possible, I'd like to get through 1 week of this where nobody's arguing about trans stuff in the chat. So I'll try to avoid going down the road of the specific things they say.
I don't know if you missed it, but it already happened, so don't worry.
Oh, it already happened? Okay.
It already happened, yeah.
Never mind. Yeah, but yes, that's like a big, right-wing line now. So yeah, there is a little bit of a funny reversal there, but yeah, but yeah, I mean, they describe it as they use the phrase 5-year strategic plan, and
oh yeah. I can't even found the actual secret plan to overthrow the West and materialism.
Yeah. Here's a line: if we view the predominant materialistic science as a giant tree, our strategy is intended as a wedge that, while relatively small, could split the trunk when applied at its weakest points. So it's like, yeah, look, I think the idea that in fact there was a sort of evangelical culture war agenda here does seem to be like verifiably true, but it is also a little bit of a separate question from whether the sort of hired gun intellectuals brought on to do this are, were and are, right? A lot of these guys are still kicking, right? Sincere about their views, and I'm sure that they were. And a lot of what a lot of the Moulton articles kind of like look at how clever and thoughtful these guys are. And it's like, yeah, look, I get it. They are, right? Like they wouldn't be good fits for the job.
Right,
if they
there's a lot of clever people out there.
Yeah, sure.
And
right.
some of them have to be wrong.
yes, very much so. It's like, look, if they didn't have the various virtues that he's talking about, the Discovery Institute wouldn't have picked them, right? That's they like, this is what makes them good, good candidates. And regardless of, putting aside the actually leaked secret plan, just look, take these guys on their own terms, right? Because it's like, look, it's possible that if they're being promoted by people who had an agenda, sure, that's consistent with them being right. So let's see, are they in fact right? And I think that they're wrong. So I think we can kind of see, like, I don't think the arguments that they presented, that Moulton mentions as essay, actually make very much sense. So there are two big arguments that he mentions. One is irreducible complexity, and the other is specified complexity. And the idea of irreducible complexity is that there are various things that we find that we find in nature that are sort of crucial to get the evolutionary process, to have it land where it needs to, that could, like, are irreducibly complex in the sense that they couldn't have evolved step by step in the way that they would need to by a process of natural selection from simpler things. So the idea is that the bacterial flagellum is like the classical example from Michael Behe, who is like probably the main advocate of the irreducible complexity argument. That if you look at the bacterial flagellum, it's like this teensy tiny little machine that if you take away any one part of it, it doesn't work. And so it doesn't make sense to think that it could have happened and it could have come about in a Darwinian way, because for it to come about in a Darwinian way, you would need to have like start with something that was kind of like it and sort of come closer and closer and closer, right? Because it's the way, and I mean, and this part is not wrong, right? Like that you need to have it be the case that you had a bunch of incremental steps that took you to something that was only sort of like it or not very much like it at all, up until you get to it. And the argument is that you would not is that you couldn't have gotten it that way, because you take away any one part of the bacterial flagellum and it's just worthless, right? That it doesn't work. So like one of an analogy that Behe, I believe was fond of was mouse traps, right? You think about like a simple mouse trap. You take away any one part of it, and it's not like it catches mice slightly less well than a complete mouse trap. It just doesn't catch mice at all, right? It's worthless. And so the bacterial flagellum is supposed to be like a mousetrap. And then specified complexity is about the idea that there is certain kinds of complicated genetic information that supposedly, wouldn't come about by chance. That it's like extremely improbable past a certain level of complexity. That it would come about by chance. That it's that like I don't know. Think about like the sort of classic thing about the monkeys with typewriters, right? That's like, yeah, if a monkey with typewriter, like the classic things, yeah, enough of them over enough time, right? They'd write Hamlet. I don't think that's actually true, but it's a fun thing to say. But certainly any one monkey with a typewriter, right? It's fantastically unlikely that it'll write Hamlet. Like if you just see Hamlet if you see a typewritten Hamlet, it's extremely unlikely that it's going to be that this was just like a monkey randomly pecking away at a keyboard. And similarly, the sort of level of complexity that you get with certain kinds of genetic information
I'm just thinking what would happen if you asked like ChatGPT 4, what is the first line of Hamlet? What is the second line of Hamlet? What is the third line of Hamlet? And how well it would write Hamlet? I think it would probably be quite bad.
Sure, I'll buy that. 255 AD is exactly right. We're going to get to that in a second. But yeah, that's So William Dembski, who is the biggest specified complexity guy, had this like mathematically intricate model that was supposed to there was supposed to be this like filter for like complex information that like after this threshold of complexity, right, you're supposed to think it's like fantastically improbable it would have just happened rather than being designed. And yeah, I think so starting with irreducible complexity, there are basically two problems. One is that even 20 years ago when these debates were playing out, the idea that like the bacterial flagellum, for example, was irreducibly complex was actually pretty dubious. In fact, you had lots of biologists who could be like, well, here's one way it possibly could have come about by stepwise evolution. And in fact, look, it's, it is reducible to simpler components. And here are different ways, that here are different pathways where we could see it coming about. And of course, evaluating whether any of these particular speculative pathways for how it could have evolved are correct sadly does get us into an area where subject matter expertise becomes relevant, right? But just in terms of understanding conceptually the basic move is exactly what 255 AD says in the chat, right? The problem with that is assuming the original form worked in the same way or served the same purpose, right? So in the essay, I quote what Darwin actually says about this. So way back in 1862, in his pithily titled "On the Various Contrivances by which British and Foreign Orchids are Fertilized by Insects and the Good Effects of Intercrossing," Darwin actually addresses basically irreducible complexity concerns, not about bacterial flagellum. He's not talking about that, right? But like that various things in nature that people might think, oh, wait a second, there's no way this could have arisen from simpler things because you take away any one piece of it and it doesn't work anymore. And Darwin writes that although an organ may not have been originally formed for some special purpose, it now serves for this end. We are justified in saying that it is specially contrived for it. On the same principle, if a man were to make a machine for some special purpose, but were to use old wheels, springs, and pulleys only slightly altered, the whole machine with all its parts might be said to have been specially contrived for that purpose. Thus, throughout nature, each part of every living being is probably served in slightly modified condition for diverse purposes and has acted in the living machinery of many ancient and distinct forms. In other words, look, even if you need all of the pieces to be in place for it to serve the purpose it serves now, you could have something with all but one of these that serves some other purpose, right? So
I was surprised that he brought up the eye example in the article, because the eye
yeah,
one is one which has become like firmly ungapped.
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
there's a whole subspecies of algae, single cell algae, who have like it's called an eye spot, which is basically kind of like a dot on their skin, which can like it's like a reflective little dot, which can detect different amounts of light, which is then connected to a nerve, um, which allows the creature to move towards bright light and away from darkness.
Yeah, right. Well, Moulton's he brings up the eye, I guess, just because it's such a stock example, but of course, it's also a classic example of something that, like, actually now we have a pretty good handle on how the reduction plays out. And yeah, there are lots of examples like this. You know, I quote Michael Shermer, who is not these days my favorite guy, but who did write some very useful and accessible things about intelligent design at the time that all these debates were happening, who uses the example of wings, right? You know, fully formed wings are obviously an excellent adaptation for flight that provides all sorts of advantages for animals who have them, but of what use is half a wing? And says, well, half wings were not poorly developed wings. They were well developed something else, perhaps thermoregulating devices. The first feathers in the fossil record, for example, are hair-like and resemble the insulating down of modern bird chicks. Since modern birds probably descended from bipedal theropod dinosaurs, wings with feathers could have been employed for regulating heat. Holding them close to the body would retain heat. Stretching them out would release heat, right? So, and people will again come up with various kinds of speculative pathways, again, at least I don't know where the state of this is in 2024, but at least as of 20 years ago when Shermer was writing, right, I give some examples what people come up with about the bacterial flagellum for how this could work and the sort of general point. So the very early 21st century equivalent of the Scopes trial was the trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, about teaching intelligent design. And one of the witnesses at that trial, the biologist Ken Miller, sort of to be to like make the point in a funny way about exaption, right, which is like a trait that was once used for one purpose being repurposed later in the evolutionary process for another purpose. He showed up to testify in the trial with a necktie that used a piece of a mousetrap as a tie clip, right? To sort of vividly make this point, right? So that's the sort of basic defense on the level of biology, that the premise just doesn't seem to be true, right? That there are in fact lots of things that might look like they're irreducibly complex, but actually, like once you get this point about exaption, it turns out that they might turn out to be awfully reducible, right? That it becomes much easier to see how they could have evolved incrementally from simpler organisms that where the trait couldn't have had this function, but it could have had some other function. But then, like, also just on the level of like philosophy and informal logic, even if the premise, like, so I think it's a bad premise, right? That's the biological point. But even beyond that, even if it were a good premise, right? Even if at present biologists were just looking at this and be like, I don't know, right? Then it would still be a terrible inference because, essentially, right, what this is God of the gap stuff that you're saying, well, we allegedly don't understand how this step happened, therefore God did it. And that therefore God did it is just not a good inference. It's also like a weird, we were kind of talking about this earlier. It's like kind of I would have to think were I a believer, I would think that it was a sort of weird, demeaning
It's very indignant
use of God, right? Like it's like really you're going to reduce God to just being this like little stopgap that you put when you can't quite explain something. It's like, oh, God must have done that.
Thou
right?
shalt not make the Lord into plaster.
yeah, exactly, right. To fill in the cracks of an explanatory structure. Yeah, right, exactly. But also it's just like, yeah, sure, you're always going to have gaps in any explanation. Science is an eternally incomplete project, right? You never get to the point where you're done and there's the, voice in the sky, you've solved reality. Do you want to play again in a different universe? That's like, yeah, you're always in the process of figuring more and stuff out, which means that there are always going to be some kind of gap in your explanation at any given point in time. So you can fill in, oh, God must have done that part. If you want, although you are going to have to constantly revise God's placement as you fill in old gaps and create new gaps, right? That it's like it used to be that we had a gap between 1 and 2. And so at 1.5, we put in God, and now we have a naturalistic 1.5. So we put in God at 1.25, to take us from 1 to 1.5. So you can do that if you want, although I think there's a sort of pessimistic induction here that we do in fact seem to continually come up with new naturalistic explanations of things. But the bigger problem is just that on an informal logic level, it's just a bad inference that because ultimately it's an argument from ignorance. You're saying,
right, I mean, you put it very well in the article that an argument against proposition B is not an argument for proposition A, and that it can be useful if you only have two propositions, but it's not clear in this case why there should only be two propositions, and in that case, it's definitely not evidence at all.
Yeah, exactly. That, I mean, if you have as a separate background premise that these are the only two possible explanations, then yeah, now it's fine. It's just disjunctive syllogism, right? A or B, not A, therefore B. But like, without that crucial premise that it's definitely either A or B, then yeah, it's a problem for explanation one doesn't add up to any sort of evidence for explanation two. For one thing, it could be that, we might have gaps in our evidence for both of them. We should just remain agnostic, even if they were the only two options, right? So at best, right, irreducible complexity would be an absence of evidence, right? For evolution, it wouldn't be positive evidence for any particular non-evolutionary explanation. And yeah, this is like, look, why not say, because if the designer you're thinking of is, I mean, look, why not say that the bacterial flagellum were, engineered by alien scientists, right? And that's just as even assuming the premise that it's this giant mystery how it could have happened in a Darwinian way, and like, look, that would be just as good. In fact, and this takes us to the sort of philosophy of science point. Yeah, look, actually, that would be better because, as a matter of fact, the evidence for the alien scientist theory is non-existent, and and it's very, very far from being the best explanation. But at least in principle, I could imagine a epistemic situation where we could acquire good evidence for the alien scientist explanation, right? That like the ancient aliens could have left traces that we could discover, right? We could find fossilized bits of their spaceships. We could figure out, reverse engineer, figure out where they came from, right? All sorts of avenues for future research could, in principle, be opened up by this. Whereas God did it isn't really like that. God did it is just kind of an explanatory brick wall that you're slamming into.
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting because it seems, again, one of those cases like with the problem of evil, where the omnipotent, all loving, all knowing God is kind of the worst possible kind of example here. Because with an all powerful God, there's no need for him to ever leave, ashes behind. There's no need for him to ever leave anything behind when he intervenes in this way. And if there is anything left behind, which would indicate that there was some sharp intervention here, this would probably be actually evidence against the all powerful, etc., God doing this, as opposed to, the alien scientist having done it.
yeah, right, exactly. So I mean, like if the alien scientist had done it, right, again, I'm not necessarily going to do so. The sort of easy way out here is just to be a Popperian about the philosophy of science and to say that the sort of line between science and pseudoscience is drawn at whether theories are refutable. And I think the more you dig into that, the more it sadly is a bit more complicated than that. And that probably
I mean,
doesn't
especially
apply.
with evolution. Like,
Yeah,
obviously, we can see how we might end up not believing in evolution, but it's hard to see how any particular fact could refute it.
yeah, right. I mean, evolution is exactly the sort of
Like,
example that
there's
I think.
no experiment you could do which would refute evolution.
Yeah, I mean, which is funny. I guess Michael Behe thinks there is, right? That's like that the discovery of this thing about the bacterial flagellum,
Yeah,
does. But
yeah.
yeah, I think like thinking about it more seriously, you should. Like, I think thinking about it like evolution is exactly the kind of example that um, uh, is exactly the kind of example that's that should nudge us towards thinking less in terms of like, uh, oh, this piece of evidence shows that this is wrong, and more in terms of thinking about, okay, what theory is the better overall explanation? Is the better explanation of whatever overall body of evidence that we've got, right? Like, so I think the Popperian thing really doesn't work. I mean, I had my phase of being really into Karl Popper, as a, finishing undergrad, starting grad school, mostly because he's a fun writer and and he's providing you with a very simple view that it's like easy to easy to understand and get on board with. But, um, you know, ultimately I do think Quine greater than symbol Popper. But even if, look, we can kind of forget the question of like, oh, what's the sort of simple dividing line between science and non-science, and just say whether you want to call it non-science or terrible science, that this is definitely something other than good, useful science, because sure, like when we're thinking about what makes a scientific theory good, it's oh, that's fun. I love Ted Chiang. Um, it's yeah, where it's like, yeah, so you want to have like a there's like a be a very simple explanation of the existing evidence, but you also want to open up like fruitful lines of future research, whereas this just doesn't, right? I mean, this is again, it's just like slamming into an explanatory wall, because by the nature of the hypothesis, right, there just isn't going to be further evidence, right? That the like it's not like, oh, well, now our next, okay, so we figured out that God did it, and then we'll figure out exactly how he did it, and then we'll like learn all this stuff about how God works. It's like, no, that's not like God by hypothesis is supposed to be an absolutely simple, non-physical entity who just wills things into being. And given that's the case, there's sort of, you know, there's sort of no further scientific inquiry there, right? To do, right? If you think that that's the, yeah,
I
I
mean,
guess God.
I've been trying to think of like what could be evidence for creationism, and it's hard to intelligent design, I don't want to call it. It's hard to think of an example which doesn't at least equally favor the alien scientist. And the only thing I can think of is like if we found some like sharp movements in species which were in some sense physically impossible.
Yeah, right.
But then the question is like, again, to go back to the thing that we said nearly at the beginning, like why is like God made physics? Why is he doing this?
Yeah, and I mean, my first instinct there would be to revisit my notion of physical, like revisit what I think the borders of physical impossibility are. It's like there's a wonderful scene in the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer where um, like on a chalkboard, he does like some complex equations to prove that it's impossible to split atoms, and his friend just waits for him to finish and be like, "Yeah, we just did it in the lab next door." Right? Like, it's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, in that situation, I wouldn't dig in. My first instinct would not be to dig in and say no, but it's definitely impossible. I'd be like, oh, maybe it's not impossible, right? Like, let's maybe revisit my theory of physics in light of this evidence. And yeah, I'm sure you could concoct something that would make me question that, but yeah, in principle, that does seem like at least a much better first move. And then specified complexity. I say less about it in the essay, but I think like broadly similar moves have are applicable there. That one, nobody actually working in information theory sort of thinks that this mathematical contraption about like figuring out the level of information that you're only going to get with like conscious intention is useful for any purpose, even when they're not thinking about evolution. So
Right.
again,
It's, the thing is like, okay, maybe that, say we accept that schematic. That schematic is useful in the absence of evidence. But then when you actually have evidence that it's not the case and that these things did happen naturally, then it's just kind of something you put to the side.
yeah, yeah, no, I think that's right. But so it's like, okay, so, but again, in the specified complexity case, once again, we have, once again, we have good reason to think that the premise is just not empirically true. And also, Moulton in his article says, he gives the example of he mentions a Darwin's Doubt, right, which was a book pushing the specified complexity line, and he says, people were just like dismissing this thing. It's like, I don't know. I mean, I pretty quickly found like an ancient blog post that has like 20 people writing reviews, like taking apart the arguments in it. So again, I think that there are sort of, from a perspective of subject matter expertise, there are good reasons to think that that's not, that the, empirical premise is pretty dubious. But again, even if the empirical premise was true, this would just be more God of the gap stuff. You're just saying, oh, we don't have a naturalistic explanation of how allegedly of how information at this level of complexity arises in the genetic process at this frequency or whatever. Therefore, God did it, right? And again, just as a proposal for how to go about the process of scientific investigation, what I say in the article is that this strikes me as approximately similar to a CSI team investigating the scene of a murder, not being able to figure out for the life of them how it happened, right? Like make it one of those classic locked room mysteries, right? And then it's like, we can't figure it out. You know what? I'll bet it was whatever suspect we started with, and he used magical powers. Done.
Hell yeah. Fucking epic. What did you write this week, Ben?
This week, this week I wrote an essay called "The Moral Case for Pushing Utilitarians Onto Trolley Tracks."
Wow.
It's about an essay by Saul Smolansky called "Should We Sacrifice the Utilitarians First?" where he argues for a view he calls designer ethics, where the moral views of the people that you're either saving or sacrificing actually end up becoming an important consideration, which I don't entirely buy, but it's fun.
It's also a classic kind of philosopher's thought experiment where you have levels of information that no one will ever have.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, no, it's very, very limited applicability. If you happen to have a trolley case play out while people are taking the train that's taking them home from the trolley ethics conference, so you know exactly what people's views are.
And what might you be writing this week?
This week, what am I writing this week? Yeah, this week, I don't know. I keep threatening to write that essay about why Gia Cohen would have hated Venmo. It's entirely possible.
Oh yeah, you said that last week, didn't you?
I did.
Well, cool. I'll bloody press the outro button.
Peace.